In this tutorial, we are going to pick up where we left off with the last one, but in this case, we're going to look at a couple other look and feel things and then some organizational stuff as well. So to start with, the scene that I left having created was just this one ramp, this cube and this sphere that these both have physics applied to them. And so what I did, the only changes I've made is I scaled up the size of the plane, and I copied this cube and then moved it and scaled it a bit so that it made a domino style shape. And then I created a few more copies of that once I had done that and repositioned them. So if I play this right now, honestly, I haven't watched it run through yet, so we'll see what happens. Right, so the ball pushes this and it actually misses those things entirely, right? But it does go ahead and bounce off the screen. So what I want to do is I'd like to get rid of this cube because clearly it's in the way. I want you to note that if I come over here, and this is cube 1, it'd be nice if I had renamed these, and we'll talk about that in a second. But this is cube 1, and if I click on this, if I make it invisible, I want you to note that that doesn't make it invisible to the physics engine, right? So if I go ahead and play this, right, it's still there, right? I can't see it, but it's still acting as a collider. This is actually a really useful thing if you want sort of an invisible boundary that people can't move past when they're interacting in your environment. That's a really simple way to do that. In order to completely disable this cube while keeping it in the scene, I don't know why I'd want to keep it. I could just delete it. But the way to completely disable it is to come over here to the inspector when I have it selected and to uncheck this little checkbox. If I hover over that, it might... nope, it doesn't tell me anything. But if I uncheck that checkbox, right, and now go ahead and run this, it should eliminate it from interacting with the world at all, right? And so there we go. And then I've successfully knocked down those dominoes. So what I would like you to do is pause the tutorial at this point. If you haven't made other things for this sphere to crash into, go ahead and make a few things. If you have a great scene going on, fantastic. Don't change it at all, because all we're going to be doing is looking at how to apply some basic materials to these objects. Okay, so hopefully you've paused it, and I'm not talking to you before you've paused it, but so we've gone through. Hopefully you have several objects that can interact with one another now. We're going to continue to use this scene in future tutorials because we've done the work of putting the assets in here and scaling them. And so now we need to, it'll just save us time as we go further forward. So let's go ahead and start by changing the names of some of these objects, right? Because right now, if I have cube and cube, I don't know which cube is which. So if I select this first cube object in the hierarchy and I right click on there, I can go down to rename, right? And I can rename this to ramp, right? Sphere, I like that word. We only have one of them in the scene. I'm just going to leave it there. But for these other cubes, I'm going to rename these as well. If I double click on it, there's something to note that actually zooms you into the object that you've selected, right? In some places, double clicking might let you change the name, but it doesn't. In here, so if I want to get back out of there, I can either zoom out, or if I double click on that, right, it's going to zoom out until it fits that plane in there, right, which sends me further away than I'd like, but that's fine. Okay, so I can go through and I can right click on here and go to rename on each of these objects. I can also rename an object by selecting it here and going up to the name field right here at the top and renaming it like, domino, 1 or something like that, right? And once I've done that, then it should change the name over here in the hierarchy as well. So go ahead and change these in whatever way you want. Um, typically it would have been easiest to have named one of them Domino and then copied and pasted it several times rather than going back later and having to rename each one. Oh, and if you do, apparently, if you type at the right speed, so if I click once and then I pause a couple seconds and click again, then I can actually edit the name. But double clicking will just zoom in on it. So 4, click once, click again. Okay. So something else I can do, right? You can imagine if I say I set up 1,000 dominoes on here that I wanted to knock down, and it was a whole pattern that was going to happen and all of that. You can imagine how awful that would be in terms of organization in the hierarchy if they were all just in this top level. And so what I can do is I can create what's called an empty object. So if I click on that plus sign, I can go to create empty, and it just calls it a game object. Note that this empty object does have the ability to have components added to it, but by default it just has its position, rotation, and scale. And so what I can do is I'm going to go ahead and rename this Dominoes. And then what I can do here is I can select Domino 1, hold down Shift, select Domino 5, and then I can just click and drag. And you'll see a little arrow there, and I'm hovering over. I'm not going so it's a blue line below. That would just move it lower in the hierarchy. But if I hover over so this is light gray, it will make them what are called children of the empty object. Now, any object can be made a child of any other object in Unity. And we'll look at reasons to do that. Sometimes maybe you've got a house that you've built, and then there's a bunch of furniture you want inside of it, right? And you want to be able to move all of that together, right? You could have your house object be the parent that controls all the children objects inside of that, right? And so, and there's other reasons to do that. Sometimes you want an object to move relative to a parent object. Like you could imagine in the solar system, the sun would be the parent and the planets would be children, right? And you want your planets to rotate around your sun, but if the sun's moving through the universe, you don't want to have to try and figure out how to move your planets independently so that they maintain their rotation around the universe, right? You want them all to be able to move as part of the solar system, right? The sun's there, the planets are moving, and then the solar system moves around the galaxy, right, as the galaxy spins. And so that's like a parent-child relationship, right? And you would say that in this case, Dominoes is the parent and object, and these are all the child objects. And there's other cool things you can do once we get into scripting, where you can address the different children. You can actually create children or remove children objects, and there's a lot of cool stuff you can do. Okay, so these are all here. Now, since I've reorganized this, it's good to just make sure that that it doesn't impact how these react in the physics engine, and it doesn't, right? It's basically exactly the same. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and pause that. All right, so that's one of the organizational things, right? It's always useful to name your objects, and trust me, because you'll start building a scene and you're going to have, many, many, many different things in there, and it can get really confusing. So please make that a habit that you do when you create objects from the beginning. Okay, so let's look at some look and feel things. So let's go ahead and start giving some materials to these so it doesn't look just like a gray mass of boring things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to the assets folder, and I'm in the scenes folder, so I'm going to go click on assets, and I'm going to double click on materials, and right now all I have is this skybox material. Now remember, because I did load this from the template, there are these example assets, and there's actually there's a bunch of materials in here, right? You'll notice some of them have really weird textures on them, and that's because this is like this is the jigsaw that was in that scene, and so it actually has all the texture maps for the outside of that object. And a lot of these things have that. But if you're interested, some of them are just base materials. You'll see that it might have a normal map on there, and we'll talk about that later. But all we're going to be working with to start with is changing colors of objects. We're not, and shininess. And so let's go ahead and go to our assets, double click on materials. And when we're in the materials folder, let's go ahead and we can either right click and go to create, or we can click on this plus sign, which basically opens up the same thing. And either way, we want to create a material, right? And because this, because I'm in the materials folder, it's automatically going to place that material in here. And this just says it's a new material. So I'm going to call this, I'm just going to call it ball mat, right? So I have some sense of what object I'm going to apply this to when I'm looking at the names. So I've got this ball material. If I go ahead and just click and drag and drop that on my ball, you'll see that it has changed color. It's now a lighter white color. If I click on the sphere object, you'll see that now instead of that grayed out shader that I had before, I've got this ball mat material. It says it's a universal render pipeline lit. And if I click on this drop down arrow, all of those all the settings that I can adjust are now available as within the component on the object. I can also select the material here, and I can make those changes here. And because it's just easier to see, I suggest that you select the material here, and let's go ahead and start making our changes. So first, there's this option for a shader. As I said in the previous tutorial, one, we want the universal render pipeline because then they'll render correctly. And again, it basically optimizes it for whatever hardware you're putting it on. And it just makes life a lot easier. If I click on this, you'll see that there are a lot of options for different types of materials. And they have all sorts of different uses. Notice that there is this unlit option here, but there's also, if I click on Universal Render Pipeline, there are 3 options in here. Whoa, did I go to particles? Oh, sorry, yeah. So if I click on Universal Render Pipeline, since that's what we're using, unless we're doing something very specific, like creating a shader graph or a skybox, or a graphic user interface or some sort of effect, we're going to be first selecting Universal Render Pipeline and then using anything that's in here. So, right, lit is the default. There is simple lit, which is just a bit more basic. There's unlit, right, which we talked about. And actually they have specific 2D materials as well. And there's terrain and nature and all these other things in here. But we're going to make sure we just leave it on lit for right now. If I change this to unlit, you'll see that it automatically just turns pure white and there's no shadows whatsoever. Sometimes this can look really cool, and can make things feel almost like almost like a cartoon, even though you're using 3D rendering software. You can make it look significantly more 2D. But we're not going to be working with that right now. We're just going to go back to Universal Render Pipeline and lit. Okay, so we've got this lit. The workflow mode currently is metallic. If I switch this to specular, these are technical terms, and it basically changes, and I'm going to zoom in on this sphere a little bit here. There we go, so we can see. And then select my material again. So it changes the way that the material works. So if I go back to metallic, I don't see a whole lot of change here. But there's a couple different options that we've got in terms of how this thing works. The surface type is opaque, right? We can do transparent as well. Right now, that adds another option in here, but I don't actually see where that went, we're just going to leave it as opaque for the time being. Oh, it ends this blending mode, and yeah, in the alpha, we're not going to worry about this yet. We'll do that when we do more advanced things. Render face is front, back, or both. We're just going to do front. We're going to leave everything else, right? Receive shadows is going to be check marked. And then we have our surface inputs. Basically, what does this actually look like? So first, let's go ahead and change the color. We can use the eyedropper to choose some existing color, or we can just click on here and make this whatever color we want. So I'm going to use the outer ring to choose my hue, and then vibrance and saturation, right? That's the H, S, and V. I'm going to adjust here, and I'm just going to make this pretty bright green. I'm going to close it. And then there's this metallic map and this smoothness option, right? And so metallic map, I currently don't have any images, texture files in there, and we'll talk about that in a second. But this allows me to either have a much more metallic shine on it, or something that's much more flat and more plastic looking. Additionally, my other major option here in terms of look and feel for this basic material is the smoothness. If I make it significantly less smooth, you'll notice that it becomes a much flatter material, right? I don't have bright highlights. If I make it smooth to a point, it gets so smooth that it's impossible to see that highlight. But if I make it smooth, right, then I get this really bright highlight on here, and it will look much shinier, right? And with the metallic matte, with the metallic map setting, right, again, if I blast this all the way out with a high smoothness, it basically goes black. And we're not going to talk about why that is right now, but it's the way light reflects off of this, and we don't have any what are called reflection probes set up. And we're not going to worry about those right now, right? But so just go ahead and set this, like if you want it to be really flat feeling, if you want it to be more metallic, you can do that. Let's go ahead, now that I've made some adjustments on here, let's go ahead and change this to specular. And I just want to show you what happens there. Specular, it basically eliminates it allows you to make it shiny or less shiny, but there's no metallic setting on there whatsoever, right? And so it's really up to you, right, which way you go with this. And the albedo alpha or metallic alpha doesn't really matter to us right now because we don't have anything in there that would make that change. So also this albedo alpha versus metallic alpha, you'll notice that there is this metallic map here, right? That's where the metallic alpha comes from. This base map is used to be called albedo, and it looks like they've changed the language there, and so, but they didn't change it here for some reason. So yeah, it doesn't really matter. What these empty gray boxes are here for is that you can take what's called a texture map, which is basically any 2D image, and you can apply it into any one of these fields to create your texture, right? So this is how, if we go and take a hop over to the example assets and go to materials, and let's say we go to our jigsaw material, you'll notice that this is filled in. If I hold down, it says Control click to show preview. There we go. Right? You can see that this is just a 2D image that someone has made from creating a 3D model and texturing that 3D model. And then this is the image that's brought from there. And you can see this is the metal layer. And so these are the parts that are more blue shine in a different way than the parts that are less blue. This is the normal map, which actually provides like bump and texture. And then they have, there's a few other things here as well, right? There's a whole bunch of different textures depending on, and you can see this construction thing, there's a whole bunch of different panels and patches. And this isn't a 3D modeling or 3D texturing course, but we'll look a little bit at, or I'll point you in directions for how to do that if you're really interested in making all of your own assets for these. Okay, so I'm going to go back to assets, go back to materials, select my ball material. And yeah, so we can leave this as metallic or whatever. And then the rest of these settings are not going to matter right now. We'll get into them later. Okay, so I've created this ball material. So why don't you take a second and go ahead and we'll create some more materials. I'm going to do one more with you to show you another way to add a material, and then we can go from there. So I'm going to right click, I'm going to go to create, and make sure that to do this I have to be in this project or the assets pane here. I'm going to go to create, I'm going to go to material, and I'm going to call this ramp mat, and then I'm going to make this, all I'm going to do is make this, you know, maybe some sort of orange, and maybe I'll make the, I'm going to change this to specular so it's a little more simple, and I'll make it, I'm going to make this pretty flat. Okay, so now I've created this and I want to apply it to the ramp. So, right, I can either just drag it and drop it in there, or I can select the ramp and I can just drag it and drop it in here. I've got those two. So then one thing to note, if I select this Dominoes object and put this material in here, nothing happens, right? It won't let me do it. It just snaps it back. And that's because it's an empty object. It doesn't have what it needs in order to display this, right? And so if I open up my Dominoes and I select one, you'll notice that within here I have my mesh renderer, and you'll see that I have this materials here, and it says element 0, and then it says lit, and that lit is this material here, right? And so I need a mesh renderer in order to apply a material to something. So if I was to then, you know, now that I've got this one selected, I can drop this in here and it will turn this orange, right? But, you know, I don't really want that to be orange. I want it to be some other color. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and create a few more, another couple materials. I might just make all the dominoes one color. You can do the same, and then we'll come back together. Just a note, you can also apply materials by clicking and dragging and dropping them onto the objects in the hierarchy. Okay, and the only thing left is the is this plane below this, so maybe I'll create one more material and add that. Okay, so now I have my materials set, and you can kind of see, right, this is a pretty, right, it's a pretty basic scene, but I do have some materials on here, and if I go ahead and play this, right, now my ball and my different pieces have different appearances. One thing you'll note is that the shadows are really, really dark right now. And one of the things that you can change pretty easily with the directional light is if I actually select the directional light, one, we can adjust the color of the light. We're going to leave it set to the way it is. We can also set the intensity of the light, right? So I can, I believe this is, I can't remember if it's 0 to 1 or I think it's got to be 1. If you put a 2 in here, no, it looks like you can make your intensity even, right, brighter or dimmer, right? If I make it 0.1, right, it's going to be a much darker scene. And so if let's go ahead and make this, you know, let's just make it 0.7. But then the other thing is I can adjust the different types of shadows I'm using. Right now, I'm using soft shadows. I can say no shadows, and then all the shadows disappear. Or hard shadows, which makes these hard-edged shadows. They're cheaper in terms of how hard they are to render, but they don't look as good. So I'm going to leave it at soft shadows. That's the default. But I can adjust the strength of the shadows, right? So I can use this slider to make it so the shadows aren't quite 100% black, right? And that makes it feel like there's light that's bouncing from somewhere else. And so now, and that gives me just a little bit better, appearance. It doesn't feel quite so intensely black and white, or, so contrasty. Okay, so I've done those things. I made that adjustment. I'm going to go ahead and stop this. And the other thing, like if you wanted to adjust the color of the light, right, there's no reason why you couldn't have like purple light. There's no reason why you couldn't have blue light. There's all sorts of ways that you can make changes to, to this light. Okay, so that's the first look and feel tutorial. Right, it's really pretty easy to apply basic materials to an object. We'll look at how to make more advanced materials, and there's many different ways to do that in the future, but these are the basics, just to make things different colors, which makes it a lot easier to see what you're doing as you're working on your projects. Okay, so go ahead and color the objects in your scene, and I'll join you for the next tutorial.